Guster's got me like.
Hello, and welcome to session 8 of my AAA. Sorry, oh goodness, something in my throat. My AAA character modeling workshop. In this stream, I'm going to be talking more about the shackles that I made last time. Uh, these fancy guys. I'm going to be talking about how I would finalize the topology for some of this for the low poly. Um, I'm going to do some brief stuff on making chains and ways that you can set up chains. Chains are fairly easy to make in general, but there are some things that make them slightly complicated depending upon how they're supposed to fit on your character or just be integrated with your character in certain ways. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the setup for that. I'm not going to do a ton of actual setup because for each program that you do stuff like chains in, the setup is going to be a little bit different. But in general, most of the same lessons will sort of apply to basically anything you're going to be working on. The next thing that I'm going to be talking about and talking about a little more in depth is how I'm going to be approaching the UV maps for this character and where I'm going to be putting things like UV seams, how I'm actually going to lay out the UVs, where I'm going to either increase or decrease the resolution in the UVs so that I have more texel density to play with. And I'm going to be talking a little bit, I think, tonight about doing hair cards, if I can actually get to it. Now, just as a reminder, I'm doing this stream tonight instead of tomorrow because tomorrow I'm going to be attending, not speaking at, but just attending a talk by some of my coworkers at the Nomon School where they're going to be going over some techniques and just generally job applicable tips and tools of the trade for being a better game artist. It's you can see it right here. There's a link on ArtStation. It's Become a Better Game Artist: How to Think Like a Game Designer. And there's a lot of information here that I'm not going to read over. But my my team lead, Gavin Goulden, and Jason Hickey are both going to be there. Jason Hickey is the lead environment artist at Insomniac, and Gavin Golden is the lead character artist. So I'm going to be hanging out there. They're going to be streaming this online on live stream and YouTube at 7:30 p.m. And a big portion of this thing is going to be Q&A. So, if there might be questions from live chat or something like that. I'm not sure exactly how that's going to work, but it should be pretty cool. So if you don't get a chance to get out there, at least watch it online. I'm sure that they're going to have some great stuff to talk about and comment on, and I'm sure that the QA session is going to be great. So that's what I'm going to be doing tomorrow night. The recording of last night's stream is up on YouTube now. If you want to go and watch that, it's up public now. And just as a reminder, next week is the last week that I'm going to be doing this workshop. I'm going to be finishing things off by talking more about hair cards if I do get to hair cards tonight. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about stuff like hard surface modeling and how that applies to clothing. Because they actually share a lot of the same concepts as far as modeling high poly clothing goes. I'm going to be talking a little bit about clothing in general and how you can make some very basic garments. I'm not going to be going too in depth with it because it's kind of outside the scope of what we're doing here. This is focused more on topology, but I am going to be talking a little bit about how you can retopologize clothing so that it's usable in ZBrush. If you've exported it from, say, Marvelous Designer or something like that. And I'm also going to be going a little more in depth on how I'm going to be finishing off this character, giving him not just clothing, but maybe like something like a satchel or something along those lines. And I mentioned at the end of last night's stream that starting very soon, we're actually recording on Sunday, I'm going to be participating in an online live stream show called Dungeons and Devs, where a bunch of game developers get together, play D&D live online, and then well, that's about it. That's pretty much the entirety of it. It should be pretty cool. The the group that I have for Sunday is all artists, but I'm also going to be looking for programmers and other people who don't necessarily get a lot of like public-facing stuff going on. You do see a lot of game directors and designers and PR people being represented and representing the game industry and being represented in games press, but you don't really see many of the artists and sort of the people on the ground who are actually making all the stuff for the games. So that's what the whole thing is about. It's about getting those people into a more public forum so that they can do something fun like play D&D, but also put faces to names or just have a good time and show people that, hey, these are actual people working on these fun games that you play. So that's going to be the first episode, sort of an episode 0, is going to be recording on Sunday. And it's going to be pre-recorded just so that we can work out all of the technical kinks and wrinkles and stuff. And then afterwards, probably not the following week, but the week after, we're trying to do it every other week. We'll have another group coming in. Each of these, if you're interested in D&D or know what D&D is like, each one is going to be a one-shot game with different people coming in each time. So if that sounds interesting, I'll have more information about that over the next week or so. And if you follow me on Twitter or anything else, I've probably been talking about it a little bit lately. So keep an eye out for talk about Dungeons and Devs. So with that in mind, let's sort of switch back to actually working on stuff. Let's switch back to actually making things. And tonight I want to talk about sort of finishing off these shackles, getting the low poly for this part more or less finished. I still have a little chunk right here that I need to put on there, so I'm going to be doing that pretty quickly. And then I'm going to start making some chains that are going to attach to this guy. Now, chains can be a difficult thing to work with because unlike ropes, they're not supposed to deform. They're supposed to sort of rotate around each other, be linked together, but be rigid as well. So that's one of those things where if you're trying to, say, put a chain around a character's neck or something along those lines, it can be a little bit difficult to get the positioning right if you have to account for a bunch of different chains. So I'm going to be doing a little bit of stuff with dynamics in Modo here, just a tiny bit, but more or less explaining the process that I use for making chains and the different ways that you can actually make chain links, because there are lots of different types of chain links, and they're really fun to make. For being such simple objects, they're actually really fun to make because they let you do a lot with just a little. You can get a surprising amount of interest and attitude out of just some simple links of chain. Before I get to that, let's go ahead and add just a little loop over here to the end of this this bit so that we can actually attach some chains to it. Attach some chains. Goodness, I can't speak tonight. And then we'll start working on the low poly for it. And there are some considerations that I'm going to make for the low poly that are different than I'd make for the low poly for something organic like this. And I'm going to be talking about those considerations that I make. Doing topology for hard surface, especially when you're going to be baking out normal maps and such, is a little bit of a different game than doing topology for something that's going to be deforming a bunch, like this shoulder or the fingers and knuckles. So let's get into that. So let me just copy and paste this back into here, and let's start adding some stuff in here. we want to have a nice loop that comes from here to here and attaches so that we can have a chain there. So the first thing that we need to do is actually add a little bit more geometry in here so that it's easier to attach things. So that's what I'm going to do right now. Let's just add some loops in here. Make sure that they're right in the middle. And then we can just move this out so it's nice and rounded. Now there are more exacting ways that I could be adding this geometry in here, but because this is a fairly large rounded shape, it doesn't really matter that much. If this was on something that was a lot more high precision, then I'd be worrying more about the actual curve of this. So now let's actually make a nice loop on here. Now there are a couple of ways that we can add a loop to this so that we can add chain links to it. The way that I'm going to do it though is actually to select these, just bevel like that, and then I'm going to bevel them outwards. Make sure that these are nice and round. Let's rotate this just a teensy bit so it's easier to attach them. I'm just going to bridge these. Alrighty, so let's get some more tension in here. Oops, maybe going back the other way. Not quite working yet. That's fine. So let's just delete this and make it easier for it to attach these pieces together. Or come out a little straighter like this. Rotate these. And because this is something that I'm going to be beating up a little bit in ZBrush, kind of like I did last night, it doesn't really matter if this is super exacting. It's something that's just going to kind of work itself out. Alright, here we go. This is getting a little better. So we'll add a couple segments in here and make sure that this is a smooth curve. And there we go. Now we've got a nice loop on there that we can then thread a chain or a rope through. Alright, now you'll notice when I subdivide this, there are some problems. This attachment right here is actually too smooth. The gradient between this and this is just way too soft, so I'm going to add some creases just like I did last night, and then I'm actually going to add some more supporting geometry by cutting along here. And what this is going to do for me is make it so that just like when I sort of decreased the tension over here by making these much closer to square, it's going to do the same thing. It's going to sort of decrease the amount of distance that a vertex has to travel to sort of bridge between those areas. In addition, it's going to make it so that I don't have any more n-gons, which I'm not really going to have to worry about anyway, since I'm going to be subdividing this and then exporting the subdivided version into ZBrush. But in case I wanted to just dump this straight into ZBrush, this is pretty convenient. But removing n-gons is not the not the main goal here. Just there we go. Alrighty. So there we go. Now there are still some problems. There's oh well, that should actually be welded, shouldn't it? There are still going to be a couple of small problems. Namely, we're going to have a little bit of a bump from this, because what's happening is this doesn't completely follow the curve that we've set out by making these polygons. So one thing that you can do to minimize that sort of bump is add more geometry around it like this, or since we're once again going to be beating this up in ZBrush, we can, if we want, just kind of ignore it. The fact that these are not going to be perfect shapes is actually going to serve us well, because those imperfect shapes will bake nicely and there will be lots of dents and scratches and stuff in the high poly. Alrighty, so this is not looking quite as beefy as I'd like to. I want the chain to look a little bit larger, a little bit chunkier. So that's not really tough to add. What I can do is I can either take these and just make them thicker this way, but that's going to make it so that the attachment is smaller. So instead of doing that, I'm actually just going to delete these and go a little bit farther out, using the same methods that I used before, but just pushing the loops that I'm using out to this loop out here as opposed to this one over here. Again, since this is a fairly organic shape and it's going to be beat up a bunch in ZBrush, I don't really need to worry if things are a little bit imperfect, because those little imperfections will actually make things look pretty nice once everything comes together. Let's just delete these. Alright. And conveniently, since I'm using multiples of 2, so 2, 4, 8, 16, etc., this has 8 edges. So that's pretty handy. So let's extrude those a little bit. Make sure that they're nice circles. Might have to do some resizing and such just to make sure that they're not flaring out in weird ways. And then we're going to slide this up just so that the attachment is a little less wonky. Oops. Let's make sure this is sliding linearly along there. There we go, that's better. Alright. Alright, now we're going to do the same thing that we did before. Just resize that so they're flat. Or actually, maybe even a little bit angled downwards. Center that. Here we go. Alright, let's bridge that. Looks like we screwed something up. Let's just clean things up a bit just to make sure nothing's janky. And things are still janky. Look at that spike down there. That's okay. Let's do this. Interesting. Well now, not sure what's going on there, but I'm sure we can fix it. Let's take a look. Might be a problem with some normals. Let's see here. Yeah, interesting. Very interesting. Well then. Oops. Let's make sure these are nice and round again. Let's see if we can connect them. There we go. That's better. Nice. So that is a lot more of what I had in mind. Alright, now, once again, adding some creased, weighted edges. There we go. Alright, cool. So, that is more or less what I had in mind for the attachment where the chains are going to go. Now, let's do the low poly for this first before we do any sort of chains, because the low poly for this is going to have some different stuff going on than the low poly for the body, and we're going to have to make some considerations for the UVs and the actual topology of this in the low poly that we wouldn't have to make for the for just the normal body parts. So first what we're going to do is we're going to rename this to Shackles High, and then we'll just duplicate this, call this Shackles Low. Now, like I did before, I'm going to take advantage of subdivisions, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to subdivide it just enough so that it has all the supporting shapes, and then I'm going to start removing loops in key areas where you're not going to be noticing that there isn't as much topology. So let's make sure that we got everything going here, and oop, goodness, I'm just screwing everything else up tonight. It has been a long week and it's not even Thursday yet. Goodness. Alright, now let's just freeze this, and now that we have it frozen, what we can do is basically just select every other loop, and especially since I've been modeling in multiples of 2, I can very easily select every other one and just go like this and remove them without breaking any of the shapes. And by just removing every other one, oh, I do have something weird going on there. I'm not sure what that missing loop was all about. Probably selected an additional one by accident. That's okay. But by selecting every other one, you retain the same shapes while getting rid of anything that's excess. And that is the beauty of modeling in multiples of 2. Now this does work with basically any even numbered geometry, but with multiples of 2, especially 8, 16, 32, it makes it super easy to get things to a very low poly state because you have so much geometry to fall back on. So let's remove some more loops, and let's start doing this. Alright, so we should be able to remove all of those without any ill effect. However, it looks like because I added a... Oh my goodness. Is it doing it again? It is doing it again. It is selecting both chunks of geometry. That's interesting. Well, I believe that since I have some UVs here, and here, let's just move these and then cut and paste. There we go. There we go. When I ran that mesh cleanup command, it probably merged some vertices that I didn't want to be merged. And it looks like, yeah, because I added that hole to the middle here, it probably added some loops that I wasn't anticipating, but that's okay. So let's see here. Let's see what we got. Looks like we have every other one selected. Yep. And down here we have every other one selected. Now we can just remove those, and things start to get cleaned up. Now since this is one long continuous shape, I don't really have to worry too much about having all these support loops, so I'm going to get rid of them. And this brings us to one of the first things that we want to consider when doing hard surface modeling, and that would be smoothing. Now, smoothing is especially problematic when you have long, thin triangles like you have here. And that's because with most types of smoothing, you run into issues like you can probably see a bit of right here, especially at glancing angles, where because the shading is averaged between two triangles, you end up with a weird sort of shading going on that's difficult to get right. So one thing that you can do to help with that is to either just cut your models up or add hard edges to areas like this. And what that'll do for you is make it so that when you go to bake, even if you use a completely smoothed cage, which you should be doing anyway, that area will receive correct shading. So let's just, oops. Let's just undo that cut because we don't actually need that cut off to a separate piece anymore. Alternately, depending upon how closely people are going to be looking at this, and it may be pretty close if this is a AAA character, you might want to retain some geometry in there or even bevel this a little bit. And we're going to add a loop right to the middle of it right here where we can split the UVs. And what that's going to do is it's going to retain some information in that crease from the high poly, because you notice the high poly, if we crank up the subdivisions a little more, the high poly has a smooth transition in this area, so it's nice to be able to retain some of that information. So one thing you can do is just build that right in to your low poly. Let's undo some of the bevel we did, and this is actually the method I'm going to use right now. I'm going to be using the wireframe from the background as a guide. I'm just going to pull this up here until it's about the right same size. And what that's going to do is it's going to make it so that I can just have a single smoothing group for this whole chunk, as opposed to splitting it up and, you know, making the cage difficult to work with and that type of thing. Now for other areas where you have more complex intersections, like this right in here, this is a case where it might be unavoidable that you'd have to have hard edges. So in that case, I'll add a hard edge in there. Yep. Let's actually do this. So this kit, the Vertex Normal kit for Modo, it's just a specialized tool that's in Modo that you know, controls vertex normals in much the same way that smoothing groups or edge smoothing in Maya works. So same general principles, just very slightly different application. Oops, let's make sure that we have edges selected, smooth those edges, and then go back to polygons and make the edges along there nice and crisp. Here we go. Now we can get rid of some more polygons in here. Now since this is one long continuous straight edge, I can just remove everything in there for the low poly. And remove these. Basically removing anything that's not going to support the shading and the UVs. And then, oh, it looks like I need to clean some of this up. So I'll do that now. There we go. So since this is one big flat area, you can just merge it all together. And that's actually going to bring me to another thing to talk about for doing hard surface modeling and smoothing. So if we smooth all of this, oops, select edges and then smooth it. So if we smooth all of this, as an n-gon, it's going to get this weird gradient going across the face of it, which naturally is a problem. Now, years ago, you would have wanted to save as many triangles as you possibly could, so you'd probably triangulate it like this. However, nowadays, because it's so cheap to render individual polygons, in a lot of cases like this, where you have lots of edges on a round surface, one thing that you can do to get slightly better shading, even if it's not 100% perfect, is to actually make it into a spike in there, a pole. That will tend to make a lot of shading a lot better these days than triangulating like this, because when you triangulate like this, you often get smoothing that goes across these faces in sort of in these directions, kind of crosswise, and that leads to very strange smoothing. So if you run into situations where you have a round piece, like say this round bit up here, I could make it so that this is just a spike like that, or I could do it this way. The main difference is how it's actually going to smooth. This isn't a great example just because it's, it's got a lot of supporting geometry around it, but the point still generally stands. These days, it's a little better to have this spike just so that you get even shading across the entire face. So let's remove some of these. Oh my, looks like we got a little extra. That's fine. And these ones, since they are essentially just flat, we don't need any of those in there. Gonna get rid of all these in here. All those. Alrighty. Get rid of that. That. We're basically just removing anything that doesn't impact the silhouette or the shading. Get rid of these, and this is looking pretty good. However, I do want to get rid of some stuff in here since I don't really need any of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this and this, and then triangulate these. These loops going down the middle are not actually affecting the shading in any way, or they won't once I have smoothing applied, or rather smoothing groups, so I don't need to worry about that. Let's do this, 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 this area is definitely one where I'll want to have multiple smoothing groups or hard edges. So do that like so. Alrighty, we're going to apply the same process over here. Let's see what we got. So this, let's just, well, first let's take this in because that's a weird shape. There we go. Alright, so we're going to just remove basically every other loop. Like so. And we'll want to keep in mind when we're doing the low poly that removing every other loop can potentially have problems up here depending upon where and when we remove things, because this is a round end. But we don't really need to worry about that right now because we know that everything is nice and even. Ooh, what is my tablet doing? I think I have a short in the USB cable. That's fun. There we go. So look at all those edges that we can remove. And we can remove all of these and not really affect any of the silhouette. Also, because we're selecting every other one, we're not removing the ones at corners, like right over here. Now we can select every other one of these. All right. Now this part, this is where things will start to get a little bit dicey with this part of the model, because you notice that from here all the way up to, oh, maybe right about there, we have a hard edge, but then it transitions into a very soft shape, a very soft sort of cross-section. So in this case, what we're actually going to want to do is separate things out a little bit. And the best way to do that right here is to triangulate along there by removing some edges and making sure that we're not removing the wrong thing from the wrong place. So let's remove this. We want to keep that there. Let's remove these because they're not contributing to the silhouette in any way. All right. So when these get triangulated, they're going to smooth, or they're going to shade really nicely, and we're not going to have to worry about, whether or not it's all quads or anything like that. All right. So how many sides do we have here? Got 30 edges, so let's do this. Nope. We're going to do it the other way. That's kind of a weird number, but that's okay. Because we're eventually going to be taking this down to a much lower state. But for now, let's just do this. So right here is where we're going to start seeing the need to triangulate. So oops, let's do that now and look at different ways that we can do that. So the first way that you triangulate might have some weird issues with it. Like, for example, this has a weird stair-step thing going on where it looks like a chunk was carved out because of the direction that it triangulated. However, you want to retain as much volume as possible, so you're going to want to adjust the triangulation. And you might want to do it in a couple of different ways just to make sure that you're retaining volume. Okay. So, by the same token, let's come up here, get rid of these, triangulate there as well. Oops. Let's get rid of the extra edges right in here, then triangulate. Now, I don't want to get rid of some of the edges for this because I do want to retain some volume, so we'll just remove those, and then we will remove some edges here and here, or rather here, and then there, so that we can retain nice shapes. And then we'll just triangulate this by attaching to there. All right. Sweet. This is looking a little high poly. So we'll just remove some edges. There's some weird stuff going on here, but we can fix it just by moving some of these edges. Once again, because I'm going to be beating this up in ZBrush, nobody's really going to be able to notice exactly what's going on in there. So we don't need to worry about it too much. Also, looks like I removed an edge in a weird place, but that's okay. So I'm going to be triangulating a bunch of this anyway. And this is a place where you actually want to remove some volume by having that sort of 90-degree angle sort of thing going on in there. Alright. Now that we have this, let's just remove these. Make sure that this goes straight across, because if we have polygons that don't go straight across, on occasion from glancing angles you'll start to see that the edges go like that. So instead of it having this sort of peak right here, that's an area that I want to just be a straight line. And actually I'm going to merge these. And this, you know what I can do to speed this up? Just remove that. Here we go. Now, one of the things that I've been really really emphasizing as I've been working on this is getting good shading results and making things easy to unwrap. Oops. And that's something that, once again, just like last time, I'm keeping that in mind continuously. I want things to be as easy as possible to UV, so that's why I am going. That's why I'm trying to retain the big shapes and the position of corners like this, because those corners match exactly with the high poly. Now I could have removed an edge next to it or something and it wouldn't have made too much difference, but for ease of selection, you know, to speed things up and make it so that it's a lot less of a hassle to, you know, select the next loop or something, I like to keep those things even. Now, another reason that in this area we want this to be straight across is that from the side, they're not these middle edges are not necessarily going to line up perfectly and be completely planar with these side edges. So that's another good reason to straighten them all out. So we will just make those linear. And there are lots of tools in other programs to do that. That's not simply like a Modo specific little tool. The same with making stuff into nice radial shapes. Those are available in lots of different programs out there. So let's just straighten these out as well. There we go. You can triangulate all these n-gons just to make sure that we are aware that they are there, and make sure that we can triangulate them in such a way that the shading is as nice as possible. And then this is an area where we're going to want to either bevel around that edge like I did before, or turn this into its own separate smoothing group. So let's try both options and see which one works better. The first option is to make that into its own smoothing group. And you notice that if I have everything else on one smoothing group, it doesn't shade very nicely around here because it's trying to average the shading on here with the shading over here. So let's now try it. Let's just select all of the hard edges, of which there are only those. Let's try beveling that. And let's make sure that things aren't going to end up looking gross by making sure we don't have stuff like this. We can turn these back into n-gons, because when we bevel, that will give us a much smoother result. Oops. Here we go. So let's do this and see what happens. Let's smooth that. All right, so it's marginally better. It's not a huge difference around here, but you do notice that the transition from this plane to this plane is a lot smoother now, and that can actually make things a lot easier for baking purposes. It'll also make it easier to select this ring right here if we don't have a bunch of triangles connected to it. So I think I'm probably going to leave this way. Alright, there we go. That's a little bit better. Now, one last area to optimize on this part of the model is this down here. This is just ugly as sin right now. So let's drastically simplify that. Now, since this connects much more closely to this part right here, I think it's okay to have the longer triangle stretching across this way. Because what's going to happen is I'm actually going to have this on its own smoothing group, and that's just going to appear as completely planar. So that's okay. One thing I do want to do is rearrange some of these triangles so that they're easier to work with, and then just turn them into a bunch of quads. Alright, now we're approaching the last part of making the low poly for this shackle. Now things are coming along pretty nicely. The only really ugly thing right now is the smoothing along this edge, or rather these edges. So some things we can do to fix that are to either bevel these like I did with these edges, or turn those into hard edges and then split them off onto their own UV islands. However, I think I probably want to bevel them, because if I'm beveling the rest, I may as well go all the way, and that's going to give me really nice clean results if, for example, I have to use a low MIP for the textures. Oh, looks like I need to rearrange some of this stuff a little bit. Let's see here. There we go, that's better. Let's just select these. Yeah. So make sure that we have these edges all selected. Let's bevel that. Now, one advantage of beveling this is that I also don't have to have multiple smoothing groups, meaning that I don't have to keep track of a bunch of different edges, meaning things are just generally simpler for me. So by beveling it, even though I'm adding a lot more polygons, I'm decreasing the work that I have to do later on, because I don't have to keep track of which polygons are smooth and which ones are sharp, or any of that stuff. I just have to look at the model and say, oh, it's smoothing correctly, because it's just what it will do. Alright. Alright, cool. I do have a problem right there. What's going on there? Something's a little bit janky with the shading right there, and I think the culprit is probably the fact that I have multiple edges coming into here, and this edge along here, along here and here, this is close to a 90-degree angle, so what it's doing is it's smoothing across these faces. So what I can do to counteract that weird smoothing error is push, sort of extend this edge and this edge upwards a little bit. So I'm just going to do that really quick. Let's turn on Z symmetry. So I can push this up a little farther. then if I relax these, they might not completely match the positioning of these polygons on the original high poly. However, they're going to get nicer shading this way, and that's really what I'm concerned with right now. So let's just relax those. There we go. Let's redo some of that shading. There we go. Yeah. If we still have problems like this, we'll make sure to adjust the triangulation so that things smooth in the correct direction. All right, that's a lot better. It's a much more smooth transition. We have the round shapes at the end, and then the sharper shapes up here. And this is going to bake really cleanly and smoothly. And when I take the high poly into ZBrush and beat up the edges and stuff, we'll still retain some of that detail in the normal map. All right. Well, now that I have the low poly more or less ready to go, I'm actually going to just make a couple of small adjustments. I'm going to add some bevels right here, along here. Oop, selected something wrong. I'm not sure why I can't deselect that. Interesting. There we go. Let's bevel that. There, now the shading between the two parts is going to match a lot better. So I can do the same here. And one area that I'm actually going to keep a hard edge is this crevice in here. One, because nobody's really going to ever be looking at that too closely, and two, because that'll actually make it a little bit easier to bake, because I can bake the entire top as a single piece separate from the rest. I can just separate this off and then bake all the rest of it as a single piece, or a separate piece rather. Cool. You know, this might also be a good candidate for a bevel down here. What do we got going on there? Oh, we got some triangulation. That's why it's acting funny. There we go. Let's retriangulate. Smooth things out. And make sure that once again this has a hard edge, because we don't really need, just like the edge up here, we can just bake this as a separate face. Oops. Alright, so our low poly for this shackle is pretty much done. There might be a couple of other small fixes that I would make. You know, like there are some areas, like in here, where no matter how I bevel this or something, this little area right here is always going to be a little bit of a pain in the ass. So really what I'm just going to do is I'm going to separate this off into smoothing groups. Nobody's ever going to see the inside of the hinge right here. All they're ever going to see is out here. So it doesn't really matter that much if it doesn't have a bevel. Alright, so now this could potentially be some sort of cinematic asset or just something on a main character. If, for example, our our werewolf guy right here was our main character for our game, you know, it might be nice to have something to match the density of this. So having the low poly be like this is pretty much ideal. Oops, looks like there is one area being here that I forgot to bevel. This is an area that people might see. It's an area that's going to strongly affect shading, so there we go. Perfect. Finished high poly. And I can actually reuse most of the UVs. There are some errors in the UVs right now just because of the method that Moto uses to unwrap UVs automatically and such. for bevels and that type of thing, but it's not really a big issue, and it's something that I can fix fairly quickly. So having unwrapped the high poly, as you saw before, made making selections easier. That'll let me select this area, and it also makes it so that I can bake textures from the high poly to itself very easily, as I demonstrated yesterday. But I'm done with the low poly for that shackle, so now I want to move on to making some chains. And let's talk about different ways that you can make links for chains, and then talk about different ways that you can attach those chains, pose them, that type of thing. So the most basic type of chain link is essentially just a donut. So you have a donut. You might want it to be a little different. Let's push this in like that. You might want this to be like this, and then you have another link like so, and like so. That's great. However, you don't often see chains that have round links like this. So there are other things you want to keep in mind when making chains. And there are other types of chains that you can make using different methods aside from just the, make a donut type shape. So let's make some square links and some diamond links. Let's make some oblong sort of links. Let's make a bunch of different links, look at the different types of ways we can make them, and then I'm going to settle on a specific type of link that I have in mind later on. So let's make a square link, or a fairly rectangular link. So you can start with a cube, or just or even just a plane, and let's just resize this. Most chain links have a bit of length to them so that they always stay oriented in an easy orientation. From there, we can bevel in, delete the center, and say, we can thicken this like so. Now, actually, you know what? Let's just bevel all the edges. Now, there's a square link. And with this square link, you can copy and paste it. Square links are pretty cool because it's really easy to snap one link to another. If your program of choice has good vertex or polygon snapping options, one thing that you can do is just snap that to there, and you won't get any gap between them, which is really handy. Now, we do want to make sure that things are aligned so that we have enough space, so we might need to rotate this a little more, because, well, chain links don't interpenetrate each other, at least not in the way that I'm thinking of. So there we go. There's some very simple square chain links. However, there are other ways that you can make square chain links. For example, you can make chain links that are, say, a diamond shape. Diamond-shaped chain links are good for things like, fantasy armor and, orcish things from Lord of the Rings, that type of stuff. Once again, you can bevel this in, delete the center. Let's try making a different one, a different method. We'll do it this way. Flip that, and then if we just connect these, well, there you have a nice diamond chain link. However, that's not generally how most diamond links work. Usually what they look like instead is this. Let's turn off snapping. Here we go. Let's mirror that along the y-axis. Okay. So this is something that you'd probably see in, say, a Lord of the Rings game or some other fantasy thing. And there are also, other changes that you can make to this by adding more spikes to it or something. It could be like, we could make it thicker. We could just kind of push this to make it thicker rings. That's kind of cool. There's lots of different ways that you can make chain links. For very standard chain links, I've got a comment in the chat. I followed purely from your responses on the Polygon article about crunch. I happen to be very opinionated about crunch time. In case you're watching this at some later date, very recently there was an opinion piece posted on Polygon from an author, writer, a video game dude who he had a lot of things to say about crunch time. And I vehemently disagree with pretty much all of them because crunch time is awful. Now, lots of people have made the argument, and actually the author himself made the argument that he was saying those things because what he specifically was trying to get across is that he, through having crunched so much, was essentially damaged emotionally or psychologically, which is fine, but the framing of the article made that much less clear. And especially with the author's word choice and other things, it sent a very negative message. That message being that crunch time is an okay thing, which it is not. Crunch time can and should be avoided, and it can and should be avoided because it's unhealthy and it leads to worse work than being late. But if you actually have enough time for things like leisure activities, resting, getting enough sleep, you're probably not going to be late anyway, unless the schedule that you have is completely insane. But we're getting slightly off topic there. So let's talk about making slightly more standard chain links. Let's look up some chain links online. So the types of chains that you usually see look a bit like this, and there are a few different ways that you can make them. You can make them by stretching a tube. However, if you just stretch a tube, you're not actually going to get these straight sections. So what you can do is you can actually take half of this donut shape and instead move it along like this, mirror it. Oops, it would help if I was mirroring in the correct direction. And then bridge. What in the world is going on there? Do I have, oh. Well, there we go. Let's just change the tension back to 100%. There we go, okay. So that is how you're going to want to make fairly standard chain links. And the good thing about these is that you can actually pull these along and stretch them in a very regular, even way, and you can get slightly deformed chain links like this. You can get ones that are more round. You can sort of deform them by pushing or pulling them and getting thinner chain links like that. Now, this is the type of chain link that you would see most often in basically any modern context. This sort of elongated shape that has it's fairly thick like so, and super simple to make. All you have to do is make half a donut and connect it to another half a donut. And now I want donuts. Ah, man. But that's not the only type of chain link. There are other different types of chain links which are based on, say, bent wire, loops that loop around each other in different ways. There are bicycle chains. The type of chain link that I want to make, though, specifically for this werewolf guy, is actually not a single continuous loop. I want something that's a little bit more interesting and a little bit more has a little bit more visual interest. So instead of just doing simple chain links, I'm actually going to use a sort of donut or torus shape here. Make that. Let's make sure that it's not too thick. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this part right here, and notice that I changed this so that it has 16 around and 8 around that way. So that means that I can select this, and it's going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 sides, meaning that I can then turn it, twist it, do it, connect it in ways that are very easy to subdivide and attach to other pieces. So now that I have this, I'm going to just delete that. I'm going to copy this, just rotate it around real quick, 180 degrees, and then I'm going to rotate it like this. Now, the last step is to bridge these like so. I'm going to add something in there, and oops, let's see here. Nope, it's a little too thin. There we go. Alright, so this is actually the type of chain link that I'm interested in giving the shackles for this werewolf dude, just because I think it's an interesting shape. Additionally, it allows me to do something fun, which is make 2 chain links, essentially, out of 1, so that I can copy and paste this, like so, without having to do any sort of rotations. Now, the advantage to doing this, even though this is a pretty uncommon type of chain link, is that I can actually have a joint, so I could have a bone stretched from here all the way to this point. And then, or maybe even like right here, so that this could rotate around that point, or this could rotate around that point. And because you're not going to be super duper up close most of the time, you're not actually going to notice that it's in a slightly odd location. Alternately, you could actually have the joint come down from the middle of here down to the middle of the cross section right here, and by rotating along there, it's pretty close to the center of where it would be rotating anyway. So this is the type of chain link that I'm interested in doing for this character, also because it allows me to get some nice silhouette. Let's just duplicate this real quick. Oh, maybe not do 80 of them. Let's just do, say, 12. Here we go. All right. So it still looks like a chain, but it has like a little bit of visual interest. If we look at just the silhouette of it, it's kind of different than other chains. It has this sort of undulating quality to it. It looks nice from multiple angles, and it has this sort of interesting look from multiple angles that changes depending upon the viewpoint. It also emphasizes some shapes. Specifically, it emphasizes the chain shape and that sort of up and down, wider and narrower sort of shape that I want. Okay, so that is, those are sort of how you can make different types of chain links. That's cool. However, chain links are difficult to position, and let's look at why. So here we have, let's make sure that this is chain. There we go. So chain links can be kind of difficult to position because they are not they're not an object like a rope that's completely flexible. They're actually made of rigid sections. So what that means is that if I want to pose this or something, I can't just do something like, like oops, I can't do something like bend it very easily, because if I bend it, well, this is not bending very well anyway, just because it's using connectivity, but let's just go back to 2. So if I try to bend it, you notice that you get weird deformation, which is not something that you would see on a chain. You know, you don't want your chain links to deform like they're made of some sort of mushy structure, because that's just not how chains work. So instead, one thing that you can do is set it up so that each of your chain links is attached to each other with, say, dynamics or a chain of bones, and then you can either pose those bones or run some dynamics on them. And I can actually show you very quickly the end result of posing things, or posing chains rather, with dynamics. I actually did it for this character right here. And you notice that this chain around his neck, let's go back up here. You notice he has this chain around his neck. I actually placed this chain around his neck by attaching each of these links to each other as a simulation, and then just draped it there. I was able to move it around a little bit, get it in the right position, and the good thing about that is that if you zoom in a little bit, you can actually see that the positioning of each individual link corresponds to where it would actually get sort of hitched onto any of the previous ones. All right, so that's just a little bit about chains. That's you know, some things to think about when you're doing chains. Let's just try very briefly to just sort of get these in the right position. Oh, and it looks like I unintentionally had some bend in there anyway. Let's just dangle these things off of this sucker right here. So we're going to have that going through there. Scale looks like it's a little bit wrong, so we can just adjust that real quick. This doesn't need to be exact. There we go. And if we want to start posing this in, say, a long curve, one thing you might want to do is separate these out into their own elements and then either parent them together or do other things, but that's okay, that's not super necessary. Alright, well, there we go. There's a very simple, quick, kind of shitty, but, you know, whatever, pose for some of these chains. Now, this is not obviously going to be the final. I'm not going to keep them in this odd position. This is just you know, for stills and such. Just keep in mind that bending your chains is going to look odd if anybody looks too closely. So you'll want to make sure that you either have bones set up for each link in the chain, or you just have some dynamics in there. But enough about chains, enough about this stuff. Let's start talking about something that a lot of people have asked me about, and that is hair cards. Let's talk about how to approach hair cards in the most basic of steps, and then from there we can start building on the knowledge that we have of hair cards over, say, the next 40 minutes for this stream and the next 2 streams next week. We can talk more about hair cards and how to build them, and the ways that you can style hair cards and do UVs for them. Finally, we'll probably talk a little bit about getting shading for hair cards right. So let's let's do something in ZBrush real quick with hair cards. It would help if it was on the right screen, wouldn't it? All right, and let's just do document, and let's load up one of those heads that we had. So we'll just go into here, modeling workshop content, Oh, it would help if we were also importing and not trying to load a Z-tool. All right, there. All right, so this is the head that we had right towards the beginning of this workshop. This is the Infinite Realities head scan. You can find it for free online. It's out there, if not in the public domain, then at least with a very sort of lax license. And you'll notice lots of people using it as an example of how to do shaders and stuff. But what I'm going to use it for tonight is to show how you can place some hair cards pretty quickly and simply to get the basic shapes for hair. And then from there, over the next few sessions, we'll talk about refining hair cards, doing things like flyaway strands, filling out the volume of hair. But tonight we're just going to get into the sort of basics of it. So if you've never worked with hair cards before, you should know that the easiest way to make hair cards is with an IMM brush, a multi-mesh brush in ZBrush. There are lots of free resources out there for this. The one that I have right here is it's by John Nasconi. He's one of my former coworkers. He's an artist at Cryptic Studios working on Neverwinter, and he created an insert multi-mesh brush for ZBrush that just lays out hair cards. So I can show you that right now. And basically all it does is, I can switch to this view. It has a beginning, which is just a simple little plane with a split down the middle. It has an end, which is basically the same thing, just rotated. And then it has the middle, which is just a single plane with a split down the middle that connects those two. And it can be any length you want. It can be multiple sizes. For my purposes, since I'm laying out the very base forms for this hair, what I want to do is make sure that I have dynamic draw size turned on, because what that's going to do is it's going to let me very consistently lay down the same size hair cards every single time, no matter how far away I am. Okay, so how do we start with hair cards? What is the main process that we use? In general, the main process that we want to use for hair cards is to have an area of your mesh where you want your hair cards. Sort of select that, or copy and paste it, or whatever you want to do, and make sure that it has been sculpted into a shape that represents at least the roughest forms of what you want your character's hair to look like. So in this case, he's going to have a hairline that's kind of a little bit high on there so that we can fill it out with more cards going down his forehead. We're just going to extract this. That's not quite right. Let's sharpen that up so we don't get any of this stuff on the ear. There we go. We'll accept that. And if we go to this, we can just start inflating bits of it and making sure that it has the thickness and volume that we're looking for in hair. This is kind of a crap example just because I'm doing it so quickly, but if you go and look online at any, say, figure sculptors, you will be able to determine good ways of sculpting big chunks of hair so that you can get at least general forms. And these general forms are going to inform us about how and where we can place our basic hair cards. So let's just turn off symmetry. Turn this into some Dynamesh. Just make sure things are nice and even. Let's just get very, very, very basic hairstyle on this guy. So he's gonna have almost like a Superman curl type of thing going on. Maybe like this. It's gonna come out like that. You might have it kind of brushed over to the side. Maybe a part over here. Do 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 do. And he's probably going to have a little bit of volume on the front. Now, one cool thing about sculpting your base shapes in ZBrush is that you can actually give yourself a guide for the flow of the hair by just doing stuff like this with the clay tubes or with whatever other sculpting tools you're using. You can guide your strokes by putting some grain to the hair. So here we go. He's almost got like a Mad Men's type of thing going on now. It's kind of a 60s or 70s long sideburns hairstyle. Oop. Looks like that's not quite correct. Alrighty, let's just inflate that a little bit. There we go. So he's a little bit of a old-fashioned kind of guy, but what this does for us is it allows us to put down the base for our hair cards by drawing directly on it like so. So I'm going to make sure this is set to dynamic. Make sure my size is pretty large because I want to be able to fill up a lot of volume very quickly. And then I just start drawing out hair cards that follow the contours of the underlying hair. Now, if this hair that you're drawing isn't high enough resolution, if it's not getting the right type of curvature, or if it's not quite as embedded in the surface as you would like, there are a few options to change this. Specifically, if you go to Stroke and Curve, you can set the curve step to be much smaller, and what that'll do is it will increase the number of polygons that it draws. So if I set this to a very small number, the steps that it uses between those edges will be much smaller, as you can see here. However, if I set the curve steps to above 1, it's going to be much longer distance. Now, something else that's useful to keep in mind when drawing hair cards like this is that these curve options actually have a lot of good stuff that you might not have even known about. Specifically, the lock start option. If you come in here and you draw with lock start, let's change the curve steps back to something a little lower. If you change it to lock start, what you can do is make it so that you can drag the start of your stroke along like that, but if you drag this end, the start stays in the same place, and this will allow you to style your hair cards before committing to them. You can drag the start of that along. Now, if you're not happy with how far out this is from the surface, I'm not very happy with that right now. If you go to Brush, and let's just move the brush palette over here. Oops. Over here. If you go to Depth, you can change the depth so that it goes below the surface. That black line along the middle of the little palette right there is the surface of the mesh, and you're pushing the center of your brush deeper or farther out in the surface. So, by adjusting that, you can see that the start of that hair card is much deeper now. That's really handy. That's something that I use all the time, and I will change depending upon what I'm working on. So something else you'll notice when drawing hair cards like this is that occasionally you'll end up with slightly sort of janky shapes, kind of like I had here. Now if you have lock start turned on in the curve options, what will happen is you can just pull on the end of the hair and smooth it out in 3D space. Okay, so that's the general basics of laying out hair cards. However, there's a little bit more to it than just laying stuff out in ZBrush like this. Hair cards in general actually have, they require multiple layers, because if you don't have multiple layers, you don't get the nice volume and coverage that you would want to be able to cover someone's bald scalp. So, for example, let me just regroup these real quick. If I just go to auto groups like that, hide this. And you notice that even though I drew a bunch of hair cards, they're all just kind of floating up there and you can see right through them. This is an instance where you'll want to lay down a bunch of large hair cards underneath everything else and then progressively work your way outwards in the hairstyle so that you get better coverage. So let's just delete those hair cards. There we go. Let's smooth that out. Okay, so let's start again, but this time we're going to start the way that I would usually start, and that is by having things pretty deep in the surface with a very large brush size, and I'm just going to lay down the base forms for where I want the hair to fill in. And from there, once I have things filled in, I'll start going farther out and using narrower hair cards. Alright, so I do want, let's look at where I want some coverage. I want some coverage certainly along the middle top of his head. I want some coverage here. I want the back of his head to be covered. I want things to be covered probably about that far down. Okay, so what I'm doing right now is thinking about where I want the highest volume of hair. The highest volume meaning the thickest chunks of hair, because those are the parts of the hair that are going to block most of his scalp. And by knowing where I want to put the thickest hair, I can know where I should start putting the largest hair cards. So by putting a bunch of large hair cards in those spaces, what I'm doing is I'm filling up those spaces with hair and making it so that even if, say, you shined a bright light on this guy's head in a game, you're not actually going to see all the way through the hair down to the scalp. So there are a couple of different ways that you can start with that. In general, though, it's probably the best idea to start at the outside of those thick regions and then work your way inwards. Because if you start on the inside, like up here, and you have that hair card, if you want to lay down a card that goes, say, in this area, it's going to be hard to get the start of that hair card underneath the existing hair card. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start from the outside over here and work my way up. And it's okay if these hair cards are not completely aligned with each other, because that's actually going to add some believability to how the hair is laid out. If you have too much uniformity and you have too many either beginnings or ends of hair cards close to each other, it's going to start looking very repetitive and very artificial. in. Okay. So in areas where you want the hair to be a little thinner, like say the back of the neck, where he'd probably have less hair anyway, unless he's a very long-haired guy, um, you'll usually want to have shorter hair cards, but ones that probably use the same textures. Here we go. And now I'm going to start working my way upwards towards the center of the hair. I'm going to adjust these so that they're not super aligned with each other. And here we go. Now we're starting to make some progress upwards. There we go. So I'm going to lay out some more hair cards, and then in a couple minutes, once I have all those laid out, I'll start talking about adding layers on top of this. For now, let's just get these laid out real quick. So we're sort of coming to the home stretch of tonight's stream. We're in right about the last 20 minutes of it. So if you guys have any questions that you want to ask, whether it's about something I covered in the stream tonight or something from a previous stream or just some questions you wanted to ask, feel free to ask in the Twitch chat because I'll be keeping an eye on that. I'm going to be finishing up just the super simple base for his hair in a second here, and then I'm going to be getting onto the next layers. But if you have any questions between now and then, feel free to drop them in there, and I'll do my best to answer. If you came in late, I just wanted to mention that at the beginning of the stream, I was talking a little bit about what's happening next week. Next week, I'm going to be getting a little bit more into hair cards. I'm going to be finishing off a lot of the topology for that werewolf guy, completing the body, and then doing some clothing and accessories for him. I'm going to be doing a simple pair of pants and basically just a vest, which is probably going to be, well, either a vest or a very simple shirt, maybe a little bit of both. And talking about topology for clothing as well as ways to bring clothing in from Marvelous Designer or other simulations, and ways that you can retopologize them in Modo. I was also talking a little bit about my upcoming project called Dungeons and Devs, which is basically just a bunch of game developers playing D&D online. The first episode of that is going to be filming on Sunday, and then after that, subsequent episodes are going to be recorded live. The sort of episode 0 that we're doing on Sunday is just to work out any technical issues, and then from there on, we're probably going to be recording twice a month, and it's going to be just a bunch of game developers online playing D&D to bring visibility to game developers who don't necessarily have as much visibility. Instead of it being, say, producers or directors, PR people, it's going to be more focused on artists and other developers who are more focused on making stuff than, say, directing stuff. So if that seems kind of interesting, I'm going to be posting information about that on my Twitter and other stuff online, so just keep an eye out. And now I've got basically the entire set of lowest level, largest hair cards on here for this guy. Now they're not perfect, and they'll require a lot of tweaking and adjustment and stuff. There are some areas that are thicker than others. For example, you can see that this side of his head has a lot less than over here. But that's not really a huge problem because I'm going to be evening some of this out, and I'm going to be adding shorter hair cards down here and that type of thing. But actually, let's sort of get into that. Let's talk about adding more layers of hair cards to this, and talking about what those different layers are for, and how you can arrange different layers so that you get better effects. I'm probably going to be talking a little bit about hair cards over the course of the next 2 streams as well. So if I don't cover something in the next, say, 15 minutes or something like 15 minutes or so, don't worry. I will be getting back to this later on. But for now, let's talk about adding more layers to this and what those layers actually do. So we have the base layer of hair cards here, and what these do is they basically block you from seeing the scalp in most areas. There are some areas where you'll want to see bits of the scalp. For example, if you have a character who has, say, sideburns over here that are trimmed short, or hair along the back of his head that's trimmed short, that type of thing, that's an area where you might want to see a little bit of scalp poking through. Also, if your character has a part in his hair, that's also another area where you'll want to see some bare scalp in there, so you won't want to have too much coverage. And that's why I've kept the hair cards in this area purposely sparse. Now, I am going to add some hair cards to add more volume to this, especially along the front over here. Now, the front of the face is obviously where people are going to be looking the most, so the area right in here is where people are going to be looking at the hair the most, and that's where we want to focus the most time, attention, and detail. So we're going to be adding multiple layers of hair cards to this, and those multiple layers are each going to contribute in different ways. So we have the initial layer of big chunky hair cards, but we want to start adding finer hair cards to increase the volume that we have, increase the coverage, and increase the sense that there is a transition from bare on his forehead to slightly covered along the very edges to fully covered once you get farther back in. So I'm actually going to, let's see, just split. Oops. Going to split hidden. And on here, I'm going to use a slightly smaller brush size. Oops, let me just change this a little bit. I'm going to use a slightly smaller hair card size. They're going to be a little narrower, and they might be poking out a little bit more from the surface. And what these are going to do is establish the main forms of the hair. Now that we have the coverage for the hair, we want to establish main forms. We want to establish the actual styling of the hair. So With this, what we're going to do is actually get much larger, distinct curves. We're going to lay out where we want the structures to be. Like if I wanted him to have sort of a Superman curl or something, I could start doing that with this hair card and then move on to finer and finer ones to build up the volume of that curve. So let's see here. Let's start adding some thicker detail and see where this goes. And as I mentioned before, it's a good idea to not keep things super well aligned. It's good to have a little bit of chaos injected into the shape of the hair so that things don't look too artificial. So it's a good idea to have the beginning and end of the hair card start in various places when you have multiple hair cards next to each other. It's also a good idea to layer hair cards on top of each other like this so that they penetrate through one another in various ways. And what that does is it increases the sense of volume by making it look like the individual hairs are sort of weaving through each other. So we did establish the general directions of the hair, but we do want something a little more specific now, so that's what I'm doing. He might have a little bit of a cowlick or wave back here, so I'm going to establish that. I want to establish that some of the hair is a little bit longer than others. I want to make it look like he brushes his hair, maybe with his hands. I want to make it look like he has hair that's a little bit unruly or something. That adds some visual interest. And I want to make it feel like his hair is absolutely coming from one direction and going to another. Additionally, I'm going to have just a few hair cards that cross perpendicular to other hair cards to add more visual interest and more breakup in the hair so that it's less easy to see where the textures for hair cards repeat. So these are the main forms of the hair. These are the areas where we want to establish how his hair flows, where the roots are in general, how long the hair is, whether he has some hair that's longer than others, whether he has some flyaway types of shapes. This is what we're establishing now. We're not establishing anything super fine, but we are establishing that he has certain shapes to his hair, and maybe that he brushes his hair with a comb or a brush or just his hand. It might be a little bit windblown. It might be that it's very neatly coiffed. It really depends on the type of character, but this is what we're now establishing with these medium resolution hair cards. So we're in the last 10 minutes of the stream tonight, so I'm not going to end up doing his entire hair with, or his entire head with this resolution of hair card, just because it's a little time consuming. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cover a couple more areas with these sort of medium resolution cards, and then I'm going to get to the high resolution ones and talk a little bit about what they're useful for. And then once these last 10 minutes are up, I'm going to be popping into the private hangout to talk with program members. So let's just finalize some stuff right over here just to get the general shapes together. And then we can start adding finer hair cards and talking about what they're useful for. Oops. Here we go. Oops, that's a little bit of a mess, but that's okay. Redo it. Okay, so there are some medium resolution hair cards, and we're starting to build up a lot more of our detail for. Whoops! Don't want to turn that into Dynamesh. No, sir. We're starting to sort of build up the shapes that this guy has for his hair. But now let's talk about higher resolution hair cards, ones that have much finer detail and are much narrower. So let's just split those off. Okay, so now that we have some basic high-res and medium-res ones, it's time to start adding ones that are specifically for detailing and for doing things like transitions from the scalp to the forehead. So this is what these nice high-resolution hair cards are for. Instead of building up volume, what we're doing is building up the sense of depth and detail overall. Now, the width of these hair cards might vary, and it probably will vary quite a lot, just so that you can get a nice feeling of depth and variation in the hair. But I'm going with ones that are pretty narrow, and I'm going to be laying lots down on top of each other so that we can get some things like flyaway strands, nice transition from forehead to scalp, etc. And you notice that I am going in the same directions as the medium hair strands so that I am following the large forms. You want to establish your large forms first in whatever you're working on, and then go to finer and finer detail. Now, one great thing about adding very high resolution hair cards like this is that you can have just a few hairs on the texture and then overlay lots of them so that you get nice transitions from one area to another. If you want to do some strands that are sort of flyaways that are supposed to be getting caught in the wind or something, you can do that very easily with these types of high resolution strands, like so. And once again, you want to vary the start and end locations for these hair strands so that they feel like they are actual individual clumps as opposed to just repetitive little bits. And it's okay if some of these little hair strands start to clump together, because that starts to add volume. Starts to add smaller volumes, which are great if you want your character to have greased or like greasy or gelled hair. In this case, what you would do is you do a bunch of hair strands and then pull the tips together. Like so. You can even have some hair strands where the ends don't actually touch the surface of, say, the forehead down here, but just kind of float above it, because depending upon how high resolution your textures are, that can actually make it look like there's a better transition from the scalp to the tips of the hair. Alrighty, so we're in the home stretch now. We've just got about 4 minutes left for the public portion of the stream, and then I'm going to be going into the private hangout. So if you have any last-minute questions that you are hoping I can answer, feel free to ask them in the Twitch chat. Otherwise, over the next couple of minutes, I'm just going to add a few more hair cards to this guy, and then I'm going to be shutting the stream down and hopping into that private chat. So fire away if you got them. And I'll try to answer. Yeah, I've got a question here. We'll be covering how to make the hair card opacity maps next week. I'm going to be touching pretty briefly on making textures for hair cards. It's a little bit of an in-depth topic to cover in a single session because there are lots of different ways to do it. But I will talk a little bit about the process you can use. We use a couple of different methods at work that sort of work together with each other, though we do have a couple of specialized tools for it. I will be talking just a little bit about how you can get some good effects in ZBrush, and I'll also point you to some articles and such that give some good information. Though doing texture creation and stuff is a little beyond the scope of this specific workshop. It is something that I'll be covering during my next workshop, which will probably be starting at the end of next month. I'll be posting announcements regarding that on Twitter and such, so keep an eye out. But as far as just setting things up so that you can do things like bake transparency, yeah, I will talk about that a little bit next week. It's not going to be hugely in-depth, but I will at least mention it. And I will be mentioning it specifically because I'm going to be doing hair cards for that crazy werewolf dude, and I'm going to be baking some hair for him. Well, there we go. So we've got a bunch of hair cards, a big mass of Dynamesh, and some stuff that we'll probably want to noodle around with to make things thicker or thinner, adjust placement, that type of thing. But there we have some basic hair card workflow. This is the method that I've been using for a while now, and it's one that a lot of people that I know use. It seems to work pretty well in most situations, and there are only a few situations where this type of workflow doesn't really serve very well. But for most applications of making hair cards, filling out the scalp of a character, and that type of thing, this tends to work very well. So if you want to do this on your own, just research how to make basic insert mesh brushes in ZBrush. Making them is pretty easy, especially for something as simple as hair cards, because all you really need are just a couple of planes that you can lay down. So we're in the last minute or so here, and I just want to thank everyone who stopped by. We had a lot of people at one point. Some people filtered in and out, and I always expect that. That's great. It means some people are interested, or some people got what they needed. So thank you all for coming, and I'm looking forward to talking to you again next week. Next week, like I said before, I'll be covering some more hair card stuff. I'm also going to be talking about finalizing the low poly for my werewolf dude here. So this guy, which is currently just a checker texture, I'm going to be finalizing the low poly for this guy. I'm going to be probably doing a little bit of work on the weekends to give him some claws and other stuff. And then I'll be making the hair cards for him, laying out the hair cards, laying out the UVs for those hair cards. I'm going to be making just some very basic clothing for him and a couple of small accessories to plop onto him, and then that'll pretty much be it. So just like today, both days next week are going to be a little bit more free form with multiple topics being covered as opposed to single topics. So if that sounds cool, stop on by. It'll be at the same time, Tuesday and Thursday. None of this silly juggling schedules around business. And also keep an eye out for Dungeons and Devs. It should be airing sometime early next week, probably on Monday or Tuesday. I'm going to need to make sure that I get all the sound and editing right for that, but that shouldn't be too much of an issue. But yeah, until then, until next Tuesday, have a good night, and I will see you guys later. I'm going to be hopping into the private stream now. So you guys have a great weekend, and I will see ya.